The PlayStation has to be one of the best and most influential consoles ever made. It was the first console to break 100 million sales, and because of that, it had an absurd amount of vastly different games released on it, many of which kickstarted entire genres of games. That is, basically, the entire reason of why I love this system so much. Not only is the library huge and filled with a ton of good stuff, but that stuff is also extremely diverse. You probably already know the story about the PlayStation. Sony and Nintendo worked on a thing together. Nintendo partnered with Philips instead. Ken Kutaragi was betrayed and then decided to make his own PlayStation. And between that time and 1994, there were some hilarious failures like the Jaguar, and some actually solid systems like the 3DO. Of course, then in late 1994, the Saturn and then PlayStation released in Japan, and then in mid-1995 in the West. Of course, after that, in mid-1996, the Nintendo 64 followed. But while the N64 was basically dead in Japan and delayed to hell in Europe, and the Saturn was dead basically everywhere but Japan, the PlayStation was big, well, just about everywhere. Because of that, developers from all over the world made PS1 games, and that's why the library is just so large and diverse. Of course, there are two more reasons: price and simplicity. Developing for any of these three systems is really difficult from a modern perspective, but back in the day, here were the key differences. Saturn developers had to work with the system's complex architecture, bad development tools, and a lack of UV mapping. The PlayStation developers had to grapple with a system that was straightforward but different in a lot of ways from most other systems, while all the early C libraries provided by Sony were all, well, honestly a bit shit. And the N64 developers had to struggle with the RAM bottleneck and horribly strict storage constraints. Remember, until 1998, the largest cartridge was 16 megabytes, and that one was expensive. And overall, I'd say Sony got the best end of the deal. It was by far the easiest to develop for, both from a developer and publisher perspective. It was pretty cheap to print discs for, and the profits per disc were great. The CD format has its own set of issues, but it allowed for massive amounts of content to be stored on each disc. This is the system of several 100-hour-long RPGs and epics, alongside long campaign racing games like Gran Turismo, and survival horror juggernauts like Resident Evil and Silent Hill. Open world games? Sure, games like Driver 1 and Driver 2 are well-known examples, with huge, sprawling open cityscapes to drive around in. They're like prototypes to GTA 3, just with absurdly large cities. But lesser-known titles like Mizerna Falls, in my opinion, outshine it by quite a bit. Mizerna Falls by itself may not be the best game in the world, or even enjoyable without a guide, but it's a dynamic, complex, and open world, and that complexity is, to me, far more impressive than the Driver 2 huge but somewhat empty world. I mean, you could fit an entire GTA game into one of those cities, and they had 4. They could have done a lot more with the concept, at least, if you want my opinion on it. If you want some more casual games, there are so many of those, including a ton of enjoyable platformers, and also medieval, which is great, by the way. The N64 and Saturn sort of have the opposite problem in retrospect. On the N64, the well-known games are also the majority of the games that are actually worth coming back to. Most of the other games aren't necessarily horrible, but there's a reason why we don't talk about Glover anymore. On the Saturn, the majority of the games worth playing today are the titles far fewer people talk about, alongside Sega's high-quality first-party output, of course, that being your Burning Rangers, Panzer Dragoons, and all. The PlayStation 1 has the best of both worlds. Not only are the popular and first-party titles simply amazing, especially for the time, but also the lesser-known stuff is often great, or at the very least impressive. That is what drives my love for this system. The sheer depth and diversity of the system's library. It's what makes it stand out so far above the other systems of this generation. While you had your fair share of RPGs, racing games and such on the Saturn, and on the N64 you had an ocean of sports and racing games, some kiddie and FPS titles, and maybe one or two games from every other genre, the PS1 had a treasure trove of games for basically anything you'd want from a console, especially if you loved RPGs. Porting games to the system was not impossible, even when those ports punched well above their weight. Quake 1 was often assumed to be unportable to the PlayStation, but they ported Quake 2 to it, something you really wouldn't expect to run on a 32MHz MIPS 1 CPU, but it sure as hell can. And it's comparable to a PC running it in software mode. Loading zones, of course, were the price you paid, but in some games, that wasn't even an issue, because you could just stream data on the fly. It's not possible in every game, of course, but loading times aren't really that big of an issue considering how the competition can also have quite a few seconds of loading, like about 8 seconds for the dam level in GoldenEye, or also around 8 seconds for a level in Quake. Just remember that poor handling of the disc or reader may make the loading times far worse regardless of console, which is why it's better to take good care of your discs, of your system, and to give kids a system which doesn't use discs, cause kids ruin discs. On average, a whole level in a game should load in about 8 seconds or so, while a mid-level loading zone should be around half if the game engine is working as intended. Graphically, the PS1's sharpness ended up being its strength, especially when compared against the N64's far muddier graphical output. This is also why the Saturn's graphics still look quite decent, as its somewhat cloudier visuals are still really sharp. Many people, including myself, argue that graphics don't really matter, but that's a bit of an oversimplification. Graphical fidelity doesn't matter. Graphics only need to be as good as the artist making the visuals needs them to be. Many PS1 games could clear that bar and presented their worlds in pretty high detail for the time, making those games feel like true 3D games, and not just 2D arcadey titles with a third dimension slapped onto them. While the N64 had faster specs on paper, in praxis the PS1 ended having the larger, denser, and deeper worlds. The PS1's controller was originally pretty solid, but the DualShock made it the best controller of the generation, a legacy that Sony has still managed to uphold, even if its unique game output that it was previously known for has been almost inexistent in recent years. Except Astrobot, a welcoming surprise. And this frustration with Sony is partially what also makes the PS1 so interesting to me. It was a console built in secret, as Sony's executives would have been against even building it in the first place, and now, the brand is massive. It feels nice to go back to the beginning when everything was experimental, most game design paradigms were not set in stone yet, and we could see what a dozen developers with some creativity and skill could do, sometimes even less than a dozen, like in the case of Crash 1. Even when you look at the games that haven't aged the best and actually play quite poorly today, they're still bursting from the seams with creativity. Games back then were cheaper to make, so you may as well make a game that's extremely experimental. There's far less to lose. Compare that to how expensive it was to make an N64 game, and it makes sense as to why most developers made games the way they did on that system. They just had to make something they'd know would sell. While people can argue over if the Saturn, PlayStation, or N64 would have been the best of the generation, everyone can agree on one thing: the PlayStation has the largest amount of good games out of any of them. And let's talk about some of the technical achievements the PS1 games managed to do. The two games that show off how big of a non-issue streaming data from the disc was had to be Driver 2 and Legacy of Kain: Soul Reaver. Driver 2, though it might be a bit more frustrating than the first game, also drops you off in a massive world you can drive around in. This game felt like a prototype of GTA 3 and this was larger, of course. Of course, many racing games loaded in data faster and further away from the player than Driver 2 did, but no other game had to deal with the player's ability to just go anywhere they wanted. in racing games you mostly just go in one of two directions, and that's far easier to account for than the player going in basically any direction they want to. Couple that with the huge selection of vehicles, the large amount of vehicles on screen, the ability to get out of your car, the ability to be a pedestrian and walk around, this really feels like a prototype for GTA 3. Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver shows off what games could do if they were fine with a smaller, more enclosed world. Basically, yeah, you could have pulled off a 3D Zelda game on PlayStation if you wanted to, with even less loading zones. Another game that does something else that's also really cool has to be Spyro. Well, not just Spyro, the whole series of Spyro games. You see, many games use fog to hide pop-in, but Spyro doesn't. Spyro has a low-detail, flat-shaded map and a high-detail, textured map. It fades between them. The PS1 could render untextured polygons twice as fast as textured ones, so you can see how it's actually pretty cheap to store two levels of the same map, one with a high detail and one with a low detail. I can think of many games that could have benefited from this approach, as even if the world rendered in the vertex mode looked nothing like the world in texture mode did, it would help immerse the player more. Crash Bandicoot ended up just having an absurdly optimized engine that could crunch through thousands of polygons per frame. They also utilized untextured polygons for Crash alongside an advanced animation system that gave Crash that animated springiness that games at the time just lacked. Finally, games like Quake 2, Alien Resurrection, and Ridge Racer Type 4 are great, just look at them examples. These games both look and feel great to play, and the first two could even be played with a mouse. Those were just the achievements though. Tons of games leveraged the CD format for detailed FMV cutscenes, pre-rendered backgrounds like in Final Fantasy or Resident Evil, while high-quality CD audio, textures, and content exist in generally most games. And that's just the technical aspect. There are so many games that are instead achievements in storytelling, gameplay, and so many other aspects. This is the console where we got the modern action-adventure genre with games like Tomb Raider, the birth of the military FPS with Medal of Honor. So many RPGs exist in this system that you just can't list all of them if you tried. There are some extremely innovative horror games beyond the standard extremely good ones people talk about. But then it hits you. You can just keep digging. You find more and more fun stuff to play. There's almost an endless sea of interesting, good stuff. But what if you don't care if the execution is good or not? Well, the PlayStation has a ton of somewhat poorly executed, janky, but still very interesting and sometimes very impressive games. There's Mizerna Falls, of course, but also a ton of cryo games. And if you want to know more about those, I'm sure Sean Seanson has you covered, as there's no way in hell I'm playing them. And there you go, I guess. From the weird and charming early titles to the absolute behemoths and progenitors of entire genres that released in the middle of the system's life, to some of the extremely impressive swan songs released around the same time as the PlayStation 2 did, or sometimes even a bit later, you can argue about hardware all you want, but one thing's for sure, the PlayStation not only had some great games on it, it also had the most of them from any contemporary system. Don't believe me? Play Mega Man Legends 2.